Welcome to this journey into the shadows of forgotten history. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from, and what time is it right now? Are you alone? Are the lights on? I always find it fascinating to know that we're sharing this moment together, scattered across the world, yet united by our curiosity for the darkest corners of the past. Today's story will take us to a place where faith became a weapon, where trust was exploited, and where an entire community chose silence over truth. This is not a story about monsters hiding in the darkness. This is a story about monsters hiding behind the pulpit. The year is 1903. The place is Hollow Creek, Arkansas, a remote settlement nestled deep in the Ouachita Mountains, where the forests are so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground, even at noon. This was a community of approximately 200 souls, most of them farmers, loggers, and their families. They lived simple lives, bound together by hard work, mutual dependence, and above all, their unwavering devotion to the Hollow Creek Baptist congregation. In this isolated world, the church wasn't just a building. It was the heartbeat of the community. And at the center of that heartbeat was Pastor Richard Thorne. Thorne had arrived in Hollow Creek in 1898, a charismatic preacher in his early 30s with piercing blue eyes and a voice that could make the hardest men weep. The previous pastor had died suddenly, and the community had been adrift, spiritually speaking. Thorne's arrival felt like divine providence. His sermons were electrifying. His knowledge of Scripture seemed boundless. Within months, the congregation had doubled in size as families from neighboring settlements made the arduous journey to hear him preach. But this story isn't really about Richard Thorne, at least not at first. This story begins with two sisters, Amelia and Ava Mallister. Amelia was 19 years old in the spring of 1903, tall and slender with dark auburn hair that she wore in a tight bun, as was proper for young women of the time. Her younger sister Ava had just turned 17. She had the same auburn hair, but her eyes were lighter, more hazel than brown. They were the daughters of Thomas and Margaret Mallister, respected members of the Hollow Creek community. In March of 1903, tragedy struck the Mallister family. Thomas and his wife were killed in an accident at the local sawmill when a steam boiler exploded. It was sudden, violent, and left Amelia and Ava completely alone in the world. They had no other family, no aunts or uncles, no grandparents still living. They had only each other, and a small house that would soon be claimed by the mill owner to settle their father's debts. It was Pastor Richard Thorne who stepped forward to offer salvation. At Thomas Mallister's funeral, Thorne delivered a powerful sermon about God's mysterious ways and the duty of the faithful to care for the orphaned and the widowed. And when the last shovel of earth had been thrown onto the graves, he made an announcement that seemed at the time to be an act of pure Christian charity. He would take the Mallister sisters into his own home. He would provide for them. He would ensure their spiritual education continued. They would want for nothing. The community praised his generosity. The sisters, numb with grief and terrified of destitution, had little choice but to accept. What happened next would remain hidden for decades, buried beneath layers of silence, fear, and religious authority. But eventually, fragments of the truth would emerge, pieces of a puzzle so disturbing that even today, more than a century later, there are those in Arkansas who refuse to speak of it. Because what Richard Thorne did to Amelia and Ava Mallister wasn't just a crime. It was a systematic destruction of their autonomy, their dignity, and possibly their lives, all carried out under the guise of divine will and spiritual duty. This is the disturbing case of the Mallister sisters, the young women who were forced to become the pastor's spiritual wives. And what you're about to hear might make you question everything you thought you knew about the power of faith and the darkness that can hide behind a collar and a cross. To understand what happened in Hollow Creek, we must first understand the world in which it occurred. The turn of the 20th century was a time of profound transformation in America, but this transformation was deeply uneven. While cities like New York and Chicago were electrifying their streets and building steel skyscrapers, vast stretches of rural America remained locked in what was essentially the previous century. Hollow Creek was one such place, located in Montgomery County, Arkansas, approximately 40 miles from the nearest town of any significant size. Hollow Creek was accessible only by rough logging roads that became impassable during the frequent rains. The community had no telegraph office, no post office of its own, and certainly no telephone lines. Mail arrived once a week, weather permitting, delivered by a rider from the county seat. The isolation was both geographical and cultural. The people of Hollow Creek were predominantly descendants of Scots-Irish settlers who had pushed into the Ouachitas in the 1840s and 1850s. They were insular, suspicious of outsiders, and deeply, fundamentally religious. The Baptist faith they practiced was strict and unforgiving. Dancing was forbidden. Alcohol was considered the devil's poison. Women were expected to be modest, obedient, and above all, submissive to male authority. This submissiveness was not merely social convention, it was theological doctrine. The Apostle Paul's words were taken as literal divine command. Wives, submit to your own husbands, as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. In Hollow Creek, this wasn't up for debate. It was simply the way things were. The community's economy was based almost entirely on timber. The vast pine and hardwood forests of the Ouachitas were being systematically harvested by logging companies, and most of the men in Hollow Creek worked either directly for these companies or in related trades like the sawmill where Thomas Mallister had died. It was dangerous work. Injuries were common. Deaths, while not frequent, were not rare either. Women in this community had few options. They could marry, they could work as domestic servants, or they could become dependent on the charity of the church. There was no other infrastructure. The state of Arkansas provided no social services to speak of. If you were orphaned, widowed, or otherwise left without male protection, you were at the mercy of your community's goodwill. And in Hollow Creek, that goodwill flowed through one man, Pastor Richard Thorne. Thorne had come from somewhere in Tennessee, though the details of his past were vague. He claimed to have been called to ministry after a profound religious experience, and he had studied scripture extensively, though he had never attended a formal seminary. This was not unusual for rural preachers of the time. What mattered was not credentials, but the ability to move a congregation, and Thorne had that ability in abundance. Contemporary accounts describe him as tall, well-built, with dark hair graying at the temples and an intensity that commanded attention. 1. Church member writing years later said that when Thorne looked at you, it felt as if he could see directly into your soul. Another said his sermons could make you feel the flames of hell licking at your feet. But there was something else about Thorne, something that would only become clear later. He was fascinated by the concept of spiritual authority and divine revelation. His sermons frequently touched on the idea that God spoke directly to certain chosen individuals, granting them insights that superseded conventional understanding. He preached about the prophets of old, men who had received direct commands from God that seemed to violate the common morality of their time. Abraham, commanded to sacrifice his son. Jacob, who took multiple wives. King David, who committed acts that would be called murder and adultery, yet was described as a man after God's own heart. Thorne would linger on these stories, emphasizing that divine will often appears incomprehensible to those who lack spiritual insight. The congregation listened raptly. They trusted him completely. And why wouldn't they? He had brought new life to their church. He visited the sick. He counseled the troubled. He seemed to genuinely care for his flock. The Hollow Creek Baptist congregation met in a white clapboard building that sat on a small rise overlooking the settlement. The building was simple but well maintained, with rows of wooden pews and a raised pulpit that gave the preacher a commanding view of his congregation. Behind the church was the parsonage, a two-story house where Thorne lived alone after his own wife had supposedly died of consumption 2 years before his arrival in Hollow Creek. Or so he claimed. No one had ever verified this. No one had thought to ask for proof. After all, why would a pastor lie? When Thomas and Margaret Mallister died in March of 1903, their daughters were left in a precarious position. The house they lived in was owned by the mill company and would need to be vacated. They had no income, no prospects, and no family. In that time and place, unmarried women without male protection were extremely vulnerable. Several families in the congregation offered to take in one or both of the sisters, but Thorne insisted that he would care for them himself. He had the space, he argued, he had the means, and most importantly, he had the spiritual authority to guide them through their grief and ensure they remained on the righteous path. The congregation agreed. Some members later recalled feeling a vague unease about the arrangement, but such feelings were quickly suppressed. After all, this was their pastor. This was a man of God. To question him felt like questioning God himself. And so, in early April of 1903, Amelia and Ava Mallister moved into the parsonage. They brought with them only what they could carry: some clothes, a few personal items, and a small leather-bound diary that had belonged to their mother. For the first few weeks, everything seemed proper. The sisters were given a shared room on the second floor. They took their meals with Thorne, helped with household chores, and attended services every Sunday and Wednesday evening, sitting in the front pew, as was expected of members of the pastor's household. But then something began to change. It started with the private Bible studies. The first indication that something was wrong came not from the Mallister sisters themselves, but from a neighbor. Sarah Pemberton was a widow in her 50s who lived in a small cabin adjacent to the church property. She had known Amelia and Ava since they were children and had been relieved when Pastor Thorne took them in. But by late May of 1903, approximately 6 weeks after the sisters moved into the parsonage, Sarah began to notice disturbing changes. The sisters, who had always been friendly and sociable, became withdrawn. When Sarah would see them in town, on the rare occasions they ventured out, they would barely make eye contact. Their faces, once animated, had become blank masks. They moved with a strange, mechanical quality, as if they were sleepwalking through their days. Sarah mentioned her concerns to her own daughter, Rebecca, who had been friends with Amelia. Rebecca agreed to try to speak with the sisters after church one Sunday in early June. What she heard disturbed her deeply. According to Rebecca's later testimony, given decades after the events, Amelia spoke in a halting, uncertain voice about the spiritual instruction they were receiving from Pastor Thorne. She said that God had given Thorne special revelation about their roles in his ministry. She said that they were being prepared for something important, something that would test their faith. When Rebecca asked what she meant, Amelia's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing more. Ava, standing beside her sister, simply stared at the ground. Rebecca reported this conversation to her mother, who was now seriously concerned. But when Sarah tried to raise the issue with other members of the congregation, she was met with resistance. Pastor Thorne was a holy man, they said. He was helping those poor orphaned girls. It was inappropriate to spread rumors or cast aspersions on his character. Sarah let the matter drop, at least publicly. But privately, she began to pay closer attention. What she observed over the following weeks would haunt her for the rest of her life. She noticed that lights in the parsonage would burn late into the night, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning. She could hear the sound of voices, though she couldn't make out words. Sometimes she thought she heard singing, but it wasn't the kind of hymns sung in church. It was something else, something that made her skin crawl. She noticed that the sisters rarely left the parsonage anymore, except to attend services. They no longer socialized with other young women in the congregation. They no longer smiled. Their faces had taken on a gaunt, hollow quality, as if they weren't eating properly. And she noticed something else, something that filled her with a cold dread she couldn't quite articulate, the way Pastor Thorne looked at the sisters. There was a possessiveness in his gaze, a proprietary quality that seemed deeply wrong. But Sarah was just one elderly widow in a community that revered its pastor. What could she do? Who would believe her if she voiced her suspicions? The answer came in early July, when everything changed. On July 8, 1903, Pastor Thorne made an announcement that shocked the congregation. He called a special Wednesday evening service, one that was mandatory for all church members. When the pews were filled, he stepped up to the pulpit with Amelia and Ava standing on either side of him. What he said next was recorded in the church minutes, a document that would be discovered much later in the county archives. Thorne announced that he had received a direct revelation from God. The Lord, he said, had spoken to him in a vision, commanding him to take Amelia and Ava as his spiritual wives. This was not, he emphasized, a matter of earthly marriage or carnal desire. This was a sacred covenant, a fulfillment of biblical prophecy that only those with true spiritual insight could understand. He referenced obscure Old Testament passages about prophets and their relationships with women. He spoke about Abraham and his concubine Hagar. He spoke about polygamy among the ancient patriarchs. He wove together scripture, personal revelation, and theological arguments with such conviction that many in the congregation were left stunned and uncertain. But he wasn't finished. He said that those who questioned this divine command were questioning God himself. He said that doubt was the voice of Satan. He said that the community must stand united in faith, must trust in the Lord's mysterious ways, or risk divine judgment. Then he conducted what he called a spiritual marriage ceremony. There were no legal documents, no marriage licenses, nothing that would be recognized by the state of Arkansas or any civil authority. But in that church, in front of that congregation, Richard Thorne declared that Amelia and Ava Mallister were now bound to him in holy matrimony before God. The sisters stood silently throughout the ceremony. Neither spoke, neither smiled. When asked to affirm their consent, they each nodded once, mechanically, as if they had been rehearsed. The congregation's reaction was mixed. Some members walked out in disgust. Others sat in stunned silence, but a significant portion, perhaps even the majority, accepted Thorne's proclamation. After all, who were they to question a man who had such a direct connection to the divine? Sarah Pemberton was among those who walked out. She would never attend the Hollow Creek Baptist congregation again. Over the following weeks, several other families also left the church, but many remained. And those who remained began to notice something deeply unsettling. The congregation itself was changing. Thorne's sermons became darker, more focused on absolute obedience and the dangers of questioning spiritual authority. He began to preach about the end times, about the importance of being among the chosen few who would be saved when Christ returned. He suggested that Hollow Creek itself might be a special place in God's plan, a refuge for the truly faithful, and he began to hold private meetings with select members of the congregation, meetings from which others were excluded. Those who attended these meetings would return with a strange look in their eyes, a kind of glazed fervor that reminded Sarah Pemberton of religious ecstatics she had once seen at a revival meeting. But what about Amelia and Ava? What was happening to them inside the parsonage? The few glimpses the outside world got were troubling. A delivery man who brought supplies to the church reported seeing the sisters in the garden behind the parsonage, working in silence, wearing long white dresses that looked more like shrouds than ordinary clothing. He said they moved like ghosts. A traveling doctor who passed through Hollow Creek in August and was called to examine a sick child happened to see the sisters in town. He later wrote in his journal that they appeared malnourished and showed signs of severe psychological distress. He asked if they needed medical attention, but they insisted they were fine and hurried away. And then came the first disappearance. In September of 1903, a young woman named Mary Catherine Shaw, aged 21, vanished from Hollow Creek without explanation. Mary Catherine had been a devout member of Thorne's congregation and had recently begun attending the private meetings he held with select members. Her family reported her missing to the county sheriff, but the investigation went nowhere. Several church members claimed that Mary Catherine had told them she was called by God to become a missionary and had left to do the Lord's work elsewhere. No one could say exactly where she had gone. No letters arrived. She simply vanished. Tell me in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe Pastor Thorne's claims of divine revelation? Or do you sense something far more sinister at work? I want to hear your theories, because what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about this case. The winter of 1903-1904 was unusually harsh in the Ouachitas. Snow fell heavily, and Hollow Creek was cut off from the outside world for weeks at a time. During this period of isolation, the community turned increasingly inward, and the influence of Pastor Richard Thorne grew even stronger. But it was also during this winter that the first cracks in his control began to appear, though it would be many years before anyone understood their significance. In January of 1904, a fire broke out in one of the logging camps several miles from Hollow Creek. A crew of men went to help fight the blaze, and among them was a young logger named Jacob Hennessy. Jacob had grown up in Hollow Creek, but had always been skeptical of organized religion. He attended church rarely and kept his distance from Pastor Thorne. While returning from the fire, Jacob took a shortcut through the woods that brought him close to the parsonage. It was late at night, well past midnight, and he assumed everyone would be asleep. But as he passed, he saw lights burning in the basement windows, which was strange because he had never noticed basement windows before. Curious and perhaps emboldened by the whiskey he had drunk to ward off the cold, Jacob crept closer. What he saw through the grimy glass would torment him for the rest of his life. The basement had been converted into what looked like a chapel, but unlike any chapel Jacob had ever seen. The walls were covered in strange symbols, not satanic exactly, but not Christian either. There were 7 chairs arranged in a circle, and in those chairs sat 7 people, all wearing white robes with hoods that obscured their faces. In the center of the circle stood Pastor Thorne, wearing a robe of deep purple, and kneeling before him, holding candles, were Amelia and Ava Mallister. Their heads were bowed, their voices, barely audible through the window, were chanting something in unison with the others. Jacob couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm was hypnotic, unsettling. He watched for perhaps 2 minutes, unable to look away, until suddenly Thorne's head snapped toward the window, as if he sensed he was being watched. Jacob ran. He ran through the snow, through the woods, ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He didn't tell anyone what he had seen. Who would believe him? And more frightening, what would Thorne do if he found out Jacob had been spying? But Jacob did do something. He began keeping a journal, documenting everything he observed about the church and the parsonage. This journal would be discovered in 1952, hidden in the attic of a house Jacob had once lived in. The entries make for deeply disturbing reading. According to Jacob's observations over the following months, a core group of approximately 10 to 12 church members seemed to form an inner circle around Thorn. They would enter the parsonage at night and remain there for hours. Jacob couldn't see what they did inside, but he noted that these same people began to change in visible ways. They became fanatically devoted to Thorn, speaking of him not just as a pastor, but as a prophet, a man who stood between them and divine truth. They isolated themselves from other members of the community. And most disturbing, several of their teenage daughters began spending time at the parsonage as well, ostensibly for religious instruction. Jacob noted the names Elizabeth Crane, age 16, Sarah Donovan, age 18, Rebecca Turner, age 17, all young women from families in Thorn's inner circle. And then, one by one, these young women disappeared from public view. The families claimed that the girls were cloistered, preparing for missionary work or engaged in intensive spiritual training. But Jacob never saw them in town again. He never saw them at Sunday services. They had simply vanished behind the walls of the parsonage. In May of 1904, Jacob made a decision that showed either tremendous courage or tremendous foolishness. He decided to break into the parsonage when he knew Thorn was away visiting a neighboring settlement. He waited until a Tuesday afternoon when he saw Thorn leave on horseback. Then he approached the parsonage, forced open a rear window, and climbed inside. The first floor was unremarkable. A kitchen, a sitting room, Thorn's study filled with theological books and papers. But when Jacob climbed the stairs to the second floor, he found something that filled him with horror. 3 of the 4 bedroom doors had been fitted with heavy locks on the outside. The doors were secured. He couldn't get in, but from behind one of the doors, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of someone crying, softly, hopelessly, as if they had been crying for so long that it had become merely a reflex. Jacob called out, asking who was there. The crying stopped immediately. There was a long silence, and then a whisper so faint he almost missed it. "Help us." He tried to force the door, but the lock was too strong. He heard footsteps downstairs. Thorn had returned earlier than expected. Jacob fled through the same window he had entered, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He ran back to his cabin and sat there, shaking for hours. That night, he wrote in his journal, "There are women locked in that house. I don't know how many. I don't know what he's doing to them. God help me, I should go to the sheriff, but who will believe me against a pastor? And what will Thorn do if he finds out it was me?" Jacob never went to the sheriff. He never told anyone what he had seen, and 3 weeks later, Jacob Hennessy disappeared. His cabin was found empty, his possessions still in place, but Jacob himself was gone. The general consensus was that he had left to find work elsewhere, perhaps in the timber camps further north. His journal remained hidden in his attic, forgotten. 2 years passed. The story of the Mallister sisters faded from general conversation in Hollow Creek. Those who had left the congregation tried to forget what they had witnessed. Those who remained had been thoroughly indoctrinated into Thorn's theology of absolute obedience. But in the spring of 1906, something happened that could not be ignored. On March 15th, a violent thunderstorm swept through the region. Lightning struck the church building, causing significant damage to the roof and starting a fire that was fortunately extinguished before the entire structure burned. But the force of the lightning strike had done something else. It had cracked open a section of the church's foundation, revealing the entrance to a cellar that no one in the current congregation knew existed. The church had been built in 1867, and the original construction records had been lost in a flood. The current members assumed the building was just a simple structure on a foundation. No one knew there was a cellar. When the damage was assessed the next morning, several men descended into the cellar with lanterns to see if the foundation had been compromised. What they found would haunt them forever. The cellar was large, perhaps 20 feet by 30 feet, with a low ceiling supported by rough wooden beams. The air was damp and had the unmistakable smell of decay. At first, in the dim light of the lanterns, the men thought the space was empty except for some old furniture, but as their eyes adjusted, they realized the furniture wasn't furniture at all. It was 7 wooden boxes, each approximately 6 feet long, arranged in a circle in the center of the cellar. Coffins. 7 coffins. The men stood frozen, not wanting to approach, not wanting to know what was inside. Finally, the eldest among them, a man named Samuel Garrett, stepped forward and opened the first coffin. It was empty, but it wasn't clean. The interior was stained with what appeared to be dried blood, and there were scratch marks on the inside of the lid, as if someone had been locked inside while still alive. The second coffin was the same. So was the third. All 7 coffins. It bore the same signs: bloodstains, scratch marks, and in 2 of them pieces of fabric that might have once been clothing or shrouds. But there were no bodies. Whatever had been in those coffins was no longer there. Samuel and the other men immediately went to find Pastor Thorne. They found him at the parsonage, where he greeted them with his usual calm demeanor. When they told him about the cellar and the coffins, his expression didn't change. He told them that the cellar was part of the church's early history, that the coffins were likely used for storing bodies during winter when the ground was too frozen for burial. He said it was an old practice in rural communities. He showed no surprise, no horror, no curiosity about why the coffins bore signs of blood and struggle. His explanation was reasonable, it was plausible, and most importantly, it allowed the men to avoid confronting a far more terrible possibility. They wanted to believe him. So they did. The cellar was sealed up. Again, the coffins were left where they were. The church was repaired, life went on, but Samuel Garrett couldn't let it go. He was a man in his 60s, a deacon in the church, and he had known Pastor Thorne since the man arrived in 1898. He had always trusted Thorne, but something about the pastor's reaction to the cellar discovery bothered him deeply. Samuel began doing something unusual for a man of his time and place. He began researching. He traveled to the county seat and examined old church records. He spoke to elderly residents who remembered the original construction of the church, and what he learned chilled him. The church had indeed had a cellar originally, but it had been sealed in 1869 after it flooded repeatedly. The entrance had been bricked over. The original coffins, if any had been stored there, would have been removed at that time, which meant the coffins Samuel and the others had found were not from the original church. They had been placed there later, after the cellar had supposedly been sealed, and the only person who would have had both the access and the opportunity to place them there was someone with keys to the church, someone like a pastor. Samuel's investigation took another dark turn when he discovered something in the county records. 3 women from Hollow Creek had been reported missing over the past decade, all of them young, all of them unmarried, and all of them last seen attending the Hollow Creek Baptist congregation. Mary Catherine Shaw, missing September 1903. Elizabeth Crane, missing June 1904. Sarah Donovan, missing October 1905. 3 missing women, 7 coffins. The math didn't add up, which meant either some coffins had never been used or there were more victims that had never been reported. Samuel confronted Pastor Thorne privately in the church, late one evening in April of 1906. He brought his findings. He asked for explanations. He demanded the truth. No one knows exactly what happened during that confrontation. Samuel Garrett's body was found the next morning in the church, apparently having fallen from the bell tower and broken his neck. Pastor Thorne reported that Samuel had come to the church to examine the storm damage, had climbed to the tower to assess the roof repairs, and had tragically lost his footing. It was ruled an accident. Samuel was buried 3 days later, and Pastor Richard Thorne delivered the eulogy. After Samuel Garrett's death, a heavy silence settled over Hollow Creek. Those who had doubts learned to keep them to themselves. The congregation, now numbering fewer than 50 members after several families had left over the years, became increasingly insular and fanatical. But the Mallister sisters remained hidden from view. No one had seen them in public for nearly 3 years. Officially, they were in seclusion, devoted to prayer and spiritual contemplation as Pastor Thorne's spiritual wives. But the reality, as would eventually be revealed through our fragments of documentation, was far darker. In 1951, during the demolition of the old parsonage, workers discovered a hidden compartment in the wall of the second-floor bedroom. Inside were pages from a diary, water-damaged and partially illegible, but bearing the name Amelia Mallister. The entries were dated between April 1903 and February 1906. They provided a glimpse into a living nightmare. The early entries described the sisters' grief over their parents' death and their gratitude for Pastor Thorne's care, but the tone shifted dramatically in May of 1903. Amelia wrote about the special instruction that Thorne had begun providing, Bible studies that occurred late at night and focused on submission, obedience, and the surrender of individual will to divine authority. By June, the entries became fragmented and disturbing. Amelia wrote about rituals she didn't understand, about being made to kneel for hours while Thorne prayed over them, about being told that they were being purified for a sacred purpose. The July entries, written around the time of the spiritual marriage ceremony, revealed that the sisters had been given no choice. Thorne had told them that God had commanded this union, that to refuse would be to condemn their souls to hell. He had isolated them, controlled their food, deprived them of sleep, and subjected them to hours of intense religious indoctrination until they no longer knew what was real. Amelia wrote, Ava cries every night. I try to comfort her, but what comfort can I give? We are prisoners here, though he calls us wives. We are slaves, though he speaks of divine love. I do not know how to escape. I do not know if we will survive. The entries from late 1903 mentioned other women joining them in the house. Elizabeth, Sarah, Rebecca, young women from the congregation who had been chosen for spiritual training. Amelia described hearing their screams at night, hearing Thorne's voice speaking to them in that calm, authoritative tone he used in sermons, breaking down their resistance, reshaping their minds. In January 1904, Amelia wrote, There are now 6 of us. We are kept in separate rooms, locked at night. During the day, we are allowed to gather for instruction and prayer. He speaks of us as his holy vessels, his connection to the divine. I think he truly believes it. That is the most terrifying part. He is not simply evil. He is mad and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. The final entry was, dated February 3rd, 1906. I have hidden these pages in the hope that someday someone will find them and know what happened here. Ava and I have made a decision. We cannot live like this anymore. We have a plan. If it fails, we will likely die. But death is preferable to this. Pray for us, whoever reads this. Pray that God, the real God, not the monster that Thorne has created, will have mercy on our souls. What happened next is unclear, but it can be pieced together from various sources. On the night of February 7th, 1906, another violent storm struck Hollow Creek. This one was even more severe than the one that had struck a year earlier. Trees were uprooted, buildings were damaged, and in the chaos of the storm, something happened at the parsonage. The next morning, Pastor Richard Thorne appeared at the church soaking wet, his face scratched and bruised. He announced that there had been a terrible tragedy. The Mallister sisters, he said, had been seized by a religious mania during the storm. They had believed they were receiving visions from God. They had run out into the tempest and had vanished into the forest. He had tried to stop them, he said. That was how he had been injured. But they were beyond reason, consumed by their visions. Search parties were organized, but the sisters were never found. The congregation accepted this explanation, or at least pretended to. But there were whispers. Some said they had heard screams from the parsonage that night, screams that had nothing to do with religious ecstasy and everything to do with terror and pain. Others noted that the other young women who had been living there, the ones receiving spiritual instruction, were also gone. Thorne said they had left to do missionary work. No one could verify this, and one more detail, mentioned only in passing in an old letter discovered in the 1970s. A farmer living 2 miles from the parsonage reported seeing a fire on the church grounds the night of the storm. Not the church itself, but somewhere behind it near the old cemetery, a large fire that burned for hours despite the rain. When the storm passed and people examined the area, they found the remains of a bonfire. The ashes were mixed with fragments of fabric, pieces of wood that might have been furniture or boxes, and something else that no one wanted to examine too closely, shards of bone. But without bodies, without witnesses willing to testify, there was no investigation. The matter was closed. The Mallister sisters were declared missing, presumed dead. The case was forgotten, almost. The story of the Mallister sisters might have been lost to time entirely, if not for a series of discoveries made decades after the events. In 1927, more than 20 years after the sisters disappeared, a young historian named Margaret Whitfield was conducting research on religious communities in rural Arkansas for her master's thesis. She came across references to Hollow Creek and became intrigued by gaps in the historical record. Several families had left the community abruptly in the early 1900s. Church records showed a dramatic decline in membership, but there was no clear explanation. Margaret traveled to what remained of Hollow Creek, which by then was largely abandoned. The timber industry had moved on, and most families had relocated to areas with better economic opportunities. The church building still stood, though it was no longer in use. The parsonage was vacant and falling into disrepair. With permission from the current property owner, Margaret explored both buildings. In the church, she found old membership records and financial documents, but nothing particularly revealing. The parsonage was more interesting. In the attic, hidden under loose floorboards, Margaret found a metal box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by various members of the congregation between 1903 and 1906. Some were never sent. Others were drafts of letters that were presumably sent elsewhere. These letters painted a picture of a community in turmoil. Several expressed concerns about Pastor Thorne's teachings. One, written by a woman named Clara Henson, described seeing the Mallister sisters and noting that they appeared like walking corpses, drained of all life and hope. Another, written by a man named Robert Mitchell, questioned the disappearance of young women from the congregation and wondered whether anyone had contacted authorities. But the most revealing letter was one written by Sarah Pemberton, the elderly widow who had first noticed changes in the sisters' behavior. This letter, addressed to her brother in Tennessee but apparently never sent, described in detail what Sarah had witnessed. She wrote about the strange ceremonies, the locked rooms, the late-night gatherings, and her growing conviction that something monstrous was occurring under the guise of religious devotion. Sarah wrote, "I am an old woman, and I no longer fear earthly consequences. I must speak the truth. Richard Thorne is not a man of God. He is a predator who has used faith as a weapon to enslave young women. I believe the Mallister sisters did not run away. I believe they are dead, and I believe he killed them. I believe others are dead as well, but I am powerless to prove it, and I am terrified of what he might do if I speak publicly. May God forgive us all for our cowardice." The letter was dated February 15th, 1906, just 8 days after the sisters' disappearance. Sarah. Pemberton died 3 months later of natural causes. The letter was never sent. Margaret included these findings in her thesis, but the document had limited circulation and was largely forgotten in academic archives. However, a copy was preserved, and it would later become a crucial piece of evidence in understanding what happened in Hollow Creek. In 1952, as mentioned earlier, Jacob Hennessy's journal was discovered during the renovation of his old home. The journal, combined with Margaret's research, began to draw the attention of regional historians and true crime enthusiasts. Articles appeared in Arkansas newspapers. People began asking questions about Hollow Creek and the mysterious pastor Richard Thorne. But what had happened to Thorne himself? Records show that he left Hollow Creek in 1907, just over a year after the Mallister sisters disappeared. He told the remaining congregation that he had been called to minister elsewhere. He traveled west, and the trail grows cold after that. There are unconfirmed reports of a Richard Thorne preaching in small communities in Oklahoma and New Mexico in the 1910s, but none can be definitively connected to the man from Hollow Creek. He simply vanished into history, leaving behind only questions and the fading memories of those he had terrorized. In 1956, a retired sheriff's deputy named Harold Watson published a memoir about his years in law enforcement in Montgomery County. In one chapter, he mentioned the Hollow Creek case. He revealed something that had never been made public. In 1906, his office had received an anonymous letter describing abuse and possible murders at the Hollow Creek Baptist Church. The letter had been detailed and specific, naming Pastor Thorne and describing the locked rooms in the parsonage. An investigation was opened, but when deputies arrived in Hollow Creek to interview witnesses, they found a united wall of silence. Church members denied everything. No one would testify. The parsonage was searched, but by then, more than 2 months had passed since the letter was written, and there was no evidence of wrongdoing. The rooms were unlocked. No signs of confinement were visible. The case was closed for lack of evidence. Watson wrote in his memoir, "I have always regretted that we could not do more. I believe terrible things happened in that community. I believe young women died there. But without witnesses, without bodies, without physical evidence, we were powerless. The law has its limits, especially in places where an entire community conspires to hide the truth." The final significant discovery came in 1978, when a construction crew was clearing land for a new development near the former site of Hollow Creek. The old cemetery had been officially abandoned decades earlier, and most of the marked graves had been relocated. But as the crew worked, their equipment unearthed something unexpected. Beneath the ground where the old church cemetery had been, approximately 15 feet from the nearest marked grave, they found a mass burial. 7 bodies, all female, all showing signs of trauma. The bodies had been buried without coffins, wrapped only in cloth that had long since deteriorated. Forensic examination was limited by the technology of the time and the advanced state of decomposition. But investigators determined that the remains were consistent with women aged between 15 and 25 who had died sometime between 1900 and 1910. Cause of death could not be definitively determined, but several of the skeletons showed fractured bones consistent with violent trauma. Could these be the Mallister sisters and the other missing women from Thorne's congregation? The dates aligned, the ages aligned, the location aligned, but definitive identification was impossible. DNA analysis was not yet available, and there were no dental records for comparison. The remains were given a proper burial in the county cemetery, marked with a simple stone that reads, 7 unknown women, 1900-1910, may they rest in peace. But for those who knew the story of Hollow Creek, the identity of those 7 women was never really in doubt. More than a century has passed since the events in Hollow Creek. The community itself no longer exists. The church building was torn down in the 1960s. The parsonage burned under mysterious circumstances in 1985. The cemetery is now overgrown forest, reclaimed by the land. But the questions remain. What exactly happened to Amelia and Ava Mallister? Were they among the 7 women buried in that unmarked grave? Did they die during the storm of February 1906, or did they survive and escape, living out their lives under assumed names in some distant place? The diary pages suggest they were planning something. Did they succeed? And what of Richard Thorne? Was he a genuine religious fanatic who believed his own twisted theology, or was he a calculated predator who used religion as a tool for exploitation? The evidence suggests elements of both. His sermons and writings show a man who had constructed an elaborate theological justification for his actions. But the calculated nature of his control, the locked rooms, the systematic isolation of his victims, all speak to deliberate cruelty. There are 3 main theories that persist about what happened in Hollow Creek. The first theory is the darkest, that Richard Thorne was a serial killer who used his position as pastor to gain access to vulnerable young women. He manipulated them, imprisoned them, abused them, and eventually murdered them. The 7 bodies found in 1978 were his victims, including the Mallister sisters. The fire reported on the night of the storm was where he burned evidence. His sudden departure from Hollow Creek in 1907 was because he sensed that suspicion was growing, and he moved on to find new victims elsewhere. The second theory is slightly more hopeful, that Amelia and Ava did indeed escape during the storm. Proponents of this theory point to the diary entry mentioning a plan and note that only 7 bodies were found, while there had been at least 8 or 9 women associated with Thorne's household at various times. They suggest that the sisters used the chaos of the storm to flee, possibly setting fire to something as a distraction, and that they successfully disappeared into anonymity, living out their lives far from Hollow Creek. The 7 bodies would be the other victims, women who either didn't escape, or whose attempts failed. The third theory is the one preferred by some researchers, that what happened in Hollow Creek was not murder in the conventional sense, but rather the tragic outcome of extreme religious manipulation and abuse. In this view, Thorne genuinely believed he was following divine commands. The women died not through direct violence, but through neglect, malnutrition, disease, or possibly suicide brought on by the psychological torment they endured. The burials were secret because Thorne knew his actions would be judged harshly by secular authorities, even if he believed himself righteous before God. Which theory is correct? We will likely never know with certainty. What we do know is this: power without accountability is dangerous. Religious authority without oversight can become a weapon, and isolation, whether geographical or social, creates conditions where abuse can flourish unseen. The Mallister sisters were real people. We have their names. We have fragments of Amelia's words in her diary. They were not just victims in a historical case study. They were young women with hopes, fears, dreams, and lives that should have stretched out before them. Instead, they became trapped in a nightmare from which there may have been no escape. Today, if you travel to Montgomery County, Arkansas, and ask about Hollow Creek, most people won't know what you're talking about. The name has faded from common knowledge. The story has become local legend, the kind of tale that gets whispered but not widely discussed. But there are still a few elderly residents who remember their grandparents speaking of Hollow Creek, who remember being told never to go near the old church site, who remember hearing that something terrible had happened there, something that was better left forgotten. They remember the name Richard Thorne, spoken with a mixture of fear and disgust. And they remember the Mallister sisters, 2 young women who trusted the wrong person. and paid a terrible price. To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what happened in that parsonage, in that church, in those locked rooms where young women were held prisoner in the name of God. The records are incomplete. The witnesses are dead. The physical evidence is limited and inconclusive, but somewhere in the forests of Arkansas, in ground that has long since reclaimed its secrets, the truth remains buried. And perhaps, in some way that transcends our understanding, Amelia and Ava Mallister have finally found the peace that was so cruelly denied to them in life. If you found this story disturbing, thought-provoking, or compelling, please leave a comment below with your theories about what really happened. Subscribe to join our haunted community and hit the bell so you never miss a journey into the darkest corners of forgotten history. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones in fairy tales. They're the ones who hide behind positions of trust and authority. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay safe.